How you doing, guys? This is Eric from RuleTheWasteland.com. There's been a lot of people making videos lately on a certain topic that I believe was kind of kicked off by Canadian Prepper doing not really a series on it, but a couple videos on the subject, and that is the idea of, or the process of growing food indoors. He's specifically working on it because obviously he lives in Canada. They have very harsh winters, a shorter growing season, so to grow any appreciable amount of produce or food, you would have to extend your growing season, and he plans on doing that by growing indoors, and he has a pretty expensive setup. That has got a lot of other people thinking about the subject, and there's a couple topics, or not even topics, but a couple of realities of growing food indoors that I wanted to talk about in this video, because for a lot of reasons, I don't think it's a good idea for a lot of preppers. Now, just to begin though, the idea of producing your own food is fantastic, and if it's an option, if it makes sense for your situation, it's definitely a fantastic idea, and it's really the only way to become long-term, self-sufficient or sustainable, is to have some level of food production on your own. But that doesn't mean that it makes sense for every particular person, and for most people, it's probably a waste of time. Now, I'm going to go ahead and mention right now that I don't think it's a waste of time for Canadian Prepper himself, because of just given the space he has to work with, the resources, the particulars of his, living situation, where he is and everything. If you've seen his videos on the subject, you've seen that he has a pretty extensive setup, a lot of resources dedicated to growing indoors, and that's kind of one of the pitfalls for normal people. When it comes to any decision that you make, whether that's preparedness or otherwise, there's always going to be opportunity costs for that, whatever you put into that decision. So opportunity cost is what you could get if you'd put that time, the resources, or whatever into something else. So just because someone might be able to get a little bit of food production, in their apartment bathtub or something, doesn't mean that that's the best use of those resources. So you might say, hey, I grew some food, isn't something better than nothing? And that's a kind of a separate concept, because obviously when it comes to food and preparedness, any additional food is better than no additional food. Something is always better than nothing. But that's not really what we're talking about. How you should be evaluating it is the resources that I'm putting into growing food indoors going to be getting me more food, or the most amount of food, compared to if I put those resources into something else. And for most people who don't have space, who don't have a lot of money or time or whatever, the answer is going to be no. And it honestly might even be no for Canadian Prepper. Like, he could obviously, probably with the money and the space, get a lot more calories or food if he put that money and resource into something else. But for him, he already has all those bases covered, so it makes sense to go into this other direction and expand out into food production. But for normal people, when you're living in an apartment or even a normal house, it's just, the return is just not going to be there. I mean, the amount of additional food or calories that you get from trying to grow indoors isn't even going to make sense. Not only is it not necessarily going to be meaningful, it's just the amount of money and effort that you have to put into it could get you so much more putting it into other areas. And just as an example of that, something like potatoes. Let's say you're growing potatoes indoors, and that's probably one of the better things to be growing. Like, a lot of people, I see these gardens, and I was going to make a whole video on this at some point. They grow things like spinach or kale or leafy greens and other vegetables that have very, very little caloric value. Like, yes, they have nutritional value in the sense that there's some vitamins and stuff in it, but I mean, you can have an entire field of spinach or lettuce or kale, and you wouldn't survive really even an additional 2 days, because there's just no carbs, there's barely any carbs that your body can use anyway, and there's just very few calories that your body can use in that. So something like potatoes would be one of the better things to grow. But even like raw potatoes only have about 400 calories per pound. So if you grew 10 pounds of potatoes, which would be like, a big bag or 2 medium bags of potatoes, that's like 2 days worth of extra food a year. And like I said, something is always better than nothing. 2 days of food is much better to have than not having those 2 days worth of food. But again, that's not really the question. The question is, of all the time and the effort and resources that you put into getting that 2 days of food through growing indoors, what could you have gotten with something else? How much does it cost to buy the lights, the containers, the different types of whatever fertilizer you're going to use, the soil, compared to a 10-pound bag of rice or 20-pound bag of rice, it costs $10, and it gives you an entire month's worth of calories. And so because with every prepping related task, not only is there an opportunity cost, there's like a scale to keep in mind. Some things scale really well, some things don't scale at all. So what I mean by scale is like the effort in dollar put in, like say $5 versus $100,000. Are you getting the same kind of return on that money? So for example, $5 spent on food storage gets you pretty much the same amount of benefit whether you're spending just $5 or whether you're spending $105,000. Now, if you're spending $100,000, you can obviously get maybe some better deals spending that kind of money in bulk, but in general, you're going to be getting just as much benefit from $5, even if that's the only money you spend, or if you're spending it after you've already spent $100,000. But that's not true with a lot of other things. Like, for example, let's say like aquaponics system. Spending $5 on, aquaponics, it's going to get you a couple of pieces, maybe a bag of gravel that will give you nothing in result. So it doesn't just scale to any amount of spending, to any amount of space. A little gallon system isn't going to work really well, and you're not going to get any productivity out of it. It's harder to balance, versus a swimming pool size system is quite the opposite. It's a lot easier to balance. You're going to get a lot of production, a lot more per dollar. So some things just don't scale as well. And growing indoors is definitely one of those things, because you could spend $150 on this stuff and maybe get your couple pounds of potatoes, and it'd probably be more than $150 depending on what you have to buy, depending on if you have to buy special kinds of lights, electricity, and if you're talking about preparedness, now you have to buy systems to be able to power that off grid and all this stuff. So I just think that is fantastic as an idea as it is to want to produce food, and everyone should be looking to see if that's an option for them. Growing indoors is just not one of those things for the vast majority of people, because I've seen people with videos like they live in apartments and they're talking about, I want to start growing indoors. I'm like, this just doesn't make sense for their situation. And it would be if you could make the argument that it teaches you how to grow and whatnot, and it's potentially true. But again, what scenarios are you going to go from apartment living to going out and farming and growing large amounts of food? And if that is something that you want to work on, then get a share, whatever they call those share plots or something, a community garden plot. Don't try to grow indoors, because that wouldn't be indicative of how you would be growing in this scenario you're envisioning anyway. Get an outdoor plot that you can go to. And yeah, you're not going to be able to probably rely on that in an emergency, but the 2-3 pots that you have inside and the 4 tomatoes that you're going to get after spending $500 and 100 hours, that's not the best spending of your resources. So, not meaning to shit on anybody's plans in this, but I do think it's really important to evaluate the realities of what you're doing, and not just the opportunity cost, but how well does this action scale and things like that. So let me know what you guys think. If you have done any indoor gardening, I think gardening, producing food is fantastic if you have the space outdoors, because compared to a couple pots, even a few hundred square foot garden, that's just the production that you can make is just not even going to compare. And there's just no way, without a major resources invested like Canadian Prepper's done, to be able to get any kind of production indoors. And he's specifically preparing for what he sees as being changes in the weather and a complete collapse scenarios and all this. And it's still going to be difficult, even with his resources and his preparation. So to do it at a larger scale is just almost pointless, I think, for most people. So let me know if you think I'm just being a cynical bastard, or if you think it's something that everyone should try. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll talk to you later.